The following program is a production of Truth for the World.
Ye servants of God, your Master proclaim, and publish abroad his wonderful name, the name all victorious of Jesus extol. His kingdom is glorious, he rules over all.
We are looking at a phrase from 2 Corinthians chapter 6 called unequally yoked. In our introduction, we're going to take a look at this passage and then ask a few questions. So let's dive right into 2 Corinthians chapter 6, starting in verse 14. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God. As God hath said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. Some of the questions we want to throw out: what does it mean to be unequally yoked? There may be some disagreement or confusion along these lines. And especially, does this apply to marriages between Christians and non-Christians? That's a question that may often come up. Let's use our hermeneutics and our principles that we've been learning to look at this particular passage and interpret it properly to get the correct biblical meaning. We're going to start with our context, the context of unequally yoked. If you look at the passages that we've read, the unequally yoked comes right in the beginning, and we've read several of the other verses. It's clear that there's a distinction between light and darkness, between belief and infidelity. So Paul is talking about those who are with Christ and those who are acting against Christ. In other words, what we're talking about is a spiritual difference between people. The questions that Paul poses are practically, if not totally, rhetorical. So Paul uses these questions to bring out the obvious message that those who are with Christ and believe in his words are not to agree with those who are not with Christ and do not believe his words. Paul goes so far as to say, if you look at verse 17, wherefore come out from among them and be ye separate. Not only is there a distinction, but Paul is saying, don't be like them, be different, right? There's a spiritual difference here is the point of the context. So in looking at the context, we might summarize that there is a distinction being made here between believers and non-believers. And a spiritual difference is what is under consideration. Believers are not to, of course, agree with non-believers. In other words, they're spiritually different. And believers are to be different from non-believers. Come out from among them and be ye separate. Touch not the unclean thing, verse 17 says. So we're talking about a spiritual difference. But some questions still remain. How are believers not to agree with non-believers? To what extent? And does this apply to the marriage of a Christian to a non-Christian? Well, let's look at our grammar. The phrase that we're looking at is, be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, from verse 14. So we'll break it down and say, be ye not. Well, the Greek verb there, to be, is in the present tense, and it's an imperative. If you remember that present tense in Greek has a continuous action aspect to it. It's ongoing. It isn't just a one-time thing. Paul isn't saying here, well, just one time don't be unequally yoked. He's saying it's an ongoing process. But on top of that, it's an imperative, which means that it is a command. So what is Paul really saying is a present tense of continuous action with a command. Really, Paul is saying stop being or becoming unequally yoked. Apparently the Corinthians were doing this, or perhaps consistently doing this, and Paul says, you got to cut that out. This consistently being unequally yoked with people, you got to cut it out. You got to stop it. Let's look at that phrase, unequally yoked. In our English, that ly word might be a good clue to let you know that we're probably dealing with an adverb. And an adverb is a word that modifies or describes a verb. So unequally is an adverb describing the verb to yoke. So what is being described here is actually the process of yoking, or the process of being yoked. Now, notice Paul says that it is unequally yoked. Unequally is modifying how the yoke is taking place, but it's not forbidding the yoking. So far, we're seeing that Paul is telling Corinthians to stop becoming yoked in a way that is unequal. The unequal is an adverb describing the process of how they're being yoked together. So they're apparently being yoked together in a way that Paul says, don't be yoked that way, not that way. But he isn't necessarily forbidding all yoking. The next phrase, with unbelievers. With is a preposition that links words together, if you remember. So Paul is linking something here. The audience of the letter, the Corinthians, are being told to stop becoming unequally yoked, and they're being told to stop doing it with unbelievers. With unbelievers is linking back to the earlier part. You got to stop becoming yoked in a way that is unequal with these unbelievers. But does God allow a Christian to be yoked or in a relationship with a non-Christian in any way? Can we look in Scripture and find that it's okay, it's not sinful for a Christian to be yoked together or in a relationship with a non-Christian? Well, the answer to that is yes. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verses 9 through 10 talks about business and everyday life. And it says, I wrote unto you in an epistle not to company with fornicators. Right? Don't company with fornicators. But notice how he clarifies this in the next verse. Yet not altogether with the fornicators of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or with idolaters, for then must ye needs go out of the world. Don't keep company with fornicators, but not 100% or not totally, because the only way you can totally not keep any company with fornicators is to leave the world. Notice also another example of marriage. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul writes about marriage in verses 12 and 13 and says, But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. You see that? If a brother, what does that mean? A Christian, has a wife that believes not, in other words, what? Is not a Christian, what does it say? Don't put her away. Don't separate yourself from them. Can you start to see the difference between what he's saying over in 2 Corinthians 6? Because what did he say in 2 Corinthians 6 verse 17? Come out from among them and be separate. Separate yourself from them. But here he says, if a Christian has a non-believing wife, don't separate. So what is being forbidden is not the yoking together. It must be the unequal way that people are yoking. The adverb is modifying the verb. Look at the next verse. The same thing. The woman which hath an husband that believeth not, if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. It's the same thing. It's just the other side of the coin, right? So there you go. What about 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 2? Peter agreed with what Paul wrote. Likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conversation of the wives. It doesn't say you should separate yourself from your husband if he's not a Christian. It says you should win him over through the way you live your life. while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear. Therefore, a Christian may be yoked to an unbeliever, provided it is not in an unequal way. What is an unequal way to be yoked with an unbeliever? What is the type of way that Paul is forbidding in 2 Corinthians 6? Well, we know what unequal is, right? When you're yoking things together, they're being associated together. But what happens when one is unequal? Well, one is heavier than the other or more powerful than the other. It depends on how you're yoking things together, right? But when one is unequal, if you imagine your scales, one is going to tip the scale one way and the other is not. That's unequal, right? Well, the context of the passage says we're dealing with what type of difference? A spiritual difference. So therefore, we may conclude that being unequally yoked would mean that a Christian has put himself in an association with an unbeliever, which that part is not forbidden. But he's done so in a way that the unbeliever is exerting more power and influence over him. So much so that the Christian is apparently in danger, as Paul says, of touching the unclean thing. The Christian has put himself in a relationship in such a way that the unequal nature has made the non-believer exert more power, more influence over the Christian, so much so that they're going to end up violating the laws of Christ, forsaking the commitment to Christ. Scriptures bear out it is not a crime and it's not a sin to be yoked, but it is wrong to be unequally yoked. The context of the passage is spiritual. What is condemned is someone who exerts their unequal power or dominance over the Christian in such a way that causes the Christian to be involved in the same ways that the infidel is involved. Let's look at the summary of the grammar. Paul is telling the Corinthians to stop becoming yoked together with unbelievers in a way that would cause them to violate the laws of Christ. Remember, unequally is an adverb modifying the yoking. It's not modifying the individuals. That would be an adjective. An adjective modifies the noun, and if it was an adjective, it would be modifying the type of people or the person with whom you're being yoked. But unequally is an adverb modifying how you're being yoked. A yoking together between a Christian and a non-Christian is not forbidden here. If we interpret this passage as a Christian shall not be yoked together with a non-Christian, now we've got contradiction between this passage and other passages, including other passages written by Paul, 1 Corinthians 7 and 1 Peter chapter 3. However, an unequal yoking is forbidden. This passage may sometime be used to say, and some people may say, it's a sin for Christians to be with non-Christians. Well, first of all, that assumes the relationship is unequal. A Christian being with a non-Christian is a yoking, but it's not necessarily unequal. Also, if the passage is translated as forbidding a relationship between a Christian and non-Christian, well, now we have a problem because that contradicts 1 Corinthians 7 and 1 Peter 3. Because those verses clearly say, if a husband and a wife are yoked together, one is a believer and one is a non-believer, they should not separate. But the difference is in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 17, in verse 14, Paul says, do not be unequally yoked, and then his remedy for that in verse 17 is to come out from among them and be ye separate. He's declaring a separation is appropriate in that regard. So if we interpret verse 14 to be a marriage between a Christian and non-Christian, the solution for that, according to 17, is to separate. But if we interpret it that way, now we've got a contradiction with 1 Corinthians 7 and 1 Peter 3. So what's our rule in hermeneutics? If scriptures contradict, you've interpreted one or more passages incorrectly, and you need to go back and do it again. So we should not interpret 2 Corinthians chapter 6 to be saying that Christians shall not marry non-Christians and that it's a sin to do so. Let's also look at logic and scriptural comparison. There is one law to which all in the Christian dispensation are amenable or answerable to, and that's the law of Christ. Now, if that's true, think about this next statement. Well, let's clarify that there is only one law first. I'm getting ahead of myself. Matthew 28:19 and 20. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. And what did Jesus tell people? Teach them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. As you go out into all the world, there's one law for everyone to follow, and that's what Christ taught his apostles and what the Holy Spirit revealed. Now, if there's only one law to which all of us in the Christian dispensation are amenable, then if it's a sin for a Christian to marry a non-Christian, then it's a sin for anyone to marry a non-Christian. You see that? Because we're all under the same law. The moment you say that this law only applies to Christians or this law only applies to non-Christians, you've just developed multiple laws of Christ for different people to follow. Acts 10:34 says God is not a respecter of persons. He doesn't make one law for these people and one law for those people. He makes one law and expects everybody to follow it. If it's sinful for a Christian to marry a non-Christian, then the Christian has entered into a marriage not sanctified by God and must repent of it and follow the instructions in verse 17, which says, come out from among them and be ye separate. So our logic is showing us that if we interpret 2 Corinthians 6:14 as a Christian may not marry a non-Christian, we've misinterpreted it. Because logic, grammar, and context are showing us that that's not the case, along with scriptural comparison. If we interpret that it's sinful for a Christian to marry a non-Christian, now we've got contradictions with 1 Corinthians 7 and 1 Peter 3 as well. And reiterating again, the rule of hermeneutics is if you've got interpretations that contradict, you've got wrong interpretations somewhere. There is only one law of Christ that applies to Christians and non-Christians. That law states that Christians and non-Christians may be yoked together, provided that the yoke is not an unequal one, causing the Christian to forsake the laws of Christ. Now I'd like to finish with one particular phrase that is sometimes shown as a proof text for those who would argue that Christians may not marry non-Christians. So we want to examine this phrase in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 39 that goes, only in the Lord. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 7:39. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. Now obviously this is talking about a wife who's unfortunately lost her husband. She's bound by the law to be with her husband as long as the husband lives. But if the husband dies, it says she's at liberty or free to marry whom she will. But then there's that little phrase that seems to be qualifying that and saying only in the Lord. So that's what we want to look at. And what does that mean? Does it mean that a Christian widow may only marry a Christian? Some people argue that based on this passage. Well, let's look at the context. There are two things I want to point out about the context of what Paul is writing to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is an interesting verse, or an interesting chapter, because Paul has a lot of advice to give regarding marriage. But if you notice from verses 25 to verse 40, and I'm not going to read it all right now, but you can go back and read it for yourself, the context is not discussing whether the individuals involved are Christians or non-Christians. Paul is discussing things like how marriage or non-marriage will affect people's behavior, whether or not to stay married, should people get married. Those are the questions that are under discussion in the context, not whether the people are Christians or non-Christians. The other thing I want to point out about the context comes from verses 25 and 26 of 1 Corinthians 7. If we remember our hermeneutics, we want to remember history and biography, meaning we want to look at the passage in the light of what was going on at that time. The history and biography tells us, Paul specifically comes out and tells us and qualifies what he is writing within the historical context of what is going on at the time. Notice 1 Corinthians 7, verses 25 and 26. Now concerning virgins I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. Notice that Paul is qualifying the advice that he's giving. He's saying, I'm giving you advice, but I do so because of what's going on right now. But Paul qualifies the advice that he's giving in 1 Corinthians 7 as being relative to the present distress. Some people go to 1 Corinthians 7 and start saying, Paul says it's better not to marry. You shouldn't marry. Paul says you shouldn't marry. Paul says maybe you shouldn't marry under the present distress. But what's our rule in hermeneutics? You can't take something written in the Bible and automatically apply it to you without looking at it properly. The Bible was written not to you, but it was written for you. And Paul is writing to the church at Corinth in this passage. And he's talking about something that's going on during the particular time that he's writing. And you have to take everything he's giving in that advice in that chapter, I believe, and put it under historical context. Because if they were under a different time period, Paul's advice might have been different. What about grammar? The phrase, only in the Lord, is basically dealing with the prepositional phrase. In is your preposition, right? The Lord, so Lord is object of the preposition. In the Lord. Prepositional phrases may sometimes function as adjectives, adjectival phrases. Or phrases may sometimes function as adverbial phrases, as adverbs. Remember, an adjective modifies a noun, an adverb modifies a verb. I believe that this phrase is functioning as an adverbial phrase. An adjective would modify a noun, but an adverb modifies a verb. I believe that the phrase is an adverbial phrase and doesn't modify the people being married because, number one, I'll give you my first reason. If there is one law of Christ and all of us are amenable to it, and marriage to non-Christians is acceptable, then that law applies to widows too. Christian widows. See, the problem goes back to the law of Christ again. The moment you say there's a different law of Christ that qualifies Christian widows to only marry Christians, you're making a law that applies to a certain group of people but doesn't apply to somebody else. And that's creating multiple laws of Christ. We were never authorized to create multiple laws of Christ. Not only that, but I believe it being an adverbial phrase, and by adverbial phrase, I hope you understand I'm meaning that what only in the Lord is modifying, if you look at the passage again, only in the Lord, I think, modifies how she gets married, because that's the verb. You see what the verb is? She's at liberty to be married to whom she will. If it was an adjectival phrase, it would modify who she's marrying. But if it's an adverbial phrase, it modifies how she's getting married. And those are two different things. I believe it's an adverbial phrase because that harmonizes with the idea that there's only one law of Christ. If you say that the only in the Lord phrase means that Christian widows can only marry Christians, now you've created two laws of Christ. So instead, I believe there's only one law of Christ, and that law applies to Christian widows as well. And that matches the context describing marriage, not individuals. You see, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, if you remember the context, if you look at verses 25 through 40, it's not talking about the individuals and whether they're Christians or not. It's talking about marriage and questions regarding marriage. Another reason is that the phrase in the Lord is used elsewhere as an adverb. Now, this doesn't prove that 1 Corinthians 7:39, only in the Lord, is being used as an adverb, but it proves that it's possible. Let's examine a couple of other verses real quickly. Colossians 3, Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as it is fit in the Lord. Now, in the Lord, does that mean wives should only submit to a husband if he is a Christian? We just looked at other verses that said wives should stay with husbands even if they're not Christians. Instead, this is an adverbial phrase saying, how do you submit yourself to your husband? And the answer is, you do it in a way that agrees and harmonizes with the law of Christ. Children, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Children should only obey their parents if their parents are Christians in the Lord? Or is this an adverbial phrase meaning that children should obey their parents provided their parents are telling them to do something that's in accordance with the law of Christ? Well, we know the answer to that. Another reason I believe that it's adverbial is because it basically harmonizes with 2 Corinthians 6:14. When we interpret 2 Corinthians 6:14, we see that yoking itself was not forbidden, but an unequal yoking that would cause someone to forsake the laws of Christ, that was forbidden. So if you look at let's look at these verses again. 2 Corinthians 6:14, do not be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. Do not be yoked with an unbeliever that causes you to forsake the laws of Christ. Now look at 1 Corinthians 7:39. The wife is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. Only if that marriage will not cause her to forsake the laws of Christ. I think those two verses are saying almost the exact same thing. In conclusion, Paul is telling the Corinthians to stop becoming yoked together with unbelievers in a way that's causing them to violate the laws of Christ. Unless an association causes someone to violate the laws of Christ, the yoking itself is not forbidden. Also, to apply a law of Christ to non-Christians, Christians, or Christian widows only is to create multiple laws of Christ to which man is amenable, and God has not authorized that. Non-Christians, Christians, or Christian widows are not forbidden to be in relationships with non-Christians. What is forbidden is how they're in relationships with non-Christians. And if that relationship is causing them to forsake their commitment to Christ, then there's a change that needs to be made. As Paul says, you need to separate yourself from that yoking because that's not good.
If you would like a free Bible correspondence course, then write us at Truth for the World, P.O. Box 241, Bethel Springs, Tennessee, 38315, the United States of America. Or visit us online at truthfortheworld.org.
Ye servants of God, your Master proclaim, and publish abroad His wonderful name.